All right, I now call on the aerial representatives from Aerial Application Association of Australia by video conference. For the Hansard record, could you please give your name and the capacity in which you're here today?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. It's Phil Hurst. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Aerial Application Association, otherwise known as 4As.
Thank you. I invite you to make a brief opening statement before the committee asks questions. Do you wish to make an opening statement?
Yes, please. Well, good morning, Senators, and thank you for your time. We'll try and get through this as quickly as we can. GA in Australia makes an enormous and vital contribution to Australia's national interest. Unfortunately, the primary restriction on the future of general aviation remains the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. Jobs, productivity and the facilitation of all we provide to our end users is being compromised by the culture of CASA, poor leadership and a fixation on introducing increasingly complex regulations not based on risk management or international best practice and with no impact on aviation safety. 4As wants to highlight the incredible courage of aviation companies and individuals coming forward to this inquiry to again highlight, as they have done many times before, in the interests of better government, the ongoing disconnect between CASA, real aviation safety, efficiency and effectiveness. We all have a deep commitment and self-interest in safety, and as you heard from McDermott Aviation, the current sausage factory of complex rules is now a significant safety risk. The gulf between honest industry experience and how CASA is seeking to represent issues is highlighted in CASA's submission to this inquiry, which we think should be filed under fiction. One thing that has not changed over the decades is the lack of coherent management systems within CASA to address long-standing criticisms, including those identified during the Forsyth report. Risk management, quality assurance, continuous improvement, standardisation, cooperation are all novel concepts to CASA, apparently. Action in the short term is both essential and possible. The answer is to address the systemic shortcomings just identified and to split CASA into two divisions. One focusing on fair paying passengers on RP2, regular public transport, and the other focusing on general aviation, including low capacity charter, aerial work operations and private and sport flying. This fundamental change sits within a classification of operations policy that recognises all operations should be safe, but that there are different and better ways of achieving this relevant to the size, complexity and culture of the companies, sectors and operations involved. This administrative restructure must also be accompanied by a new way of doing business for CASA and GA, where cooperation with the GA industry leads to a deeper understanding of the risks involved and drives a simplification of regulations. The framework for this already exists through sector profiles, but these very useful documents based on real safety data and cooperative work with the sector are purposely ignored in the current regulatory drafting process. Finally, culture change is essential at CASA, and that comes from leadership. You can't keep doing more of the same and expect better outcomes. The new CASA leadership team that we're looking forward to working with must move quickly to a more accountable, transparent and efficient organisation that recognises that a healthy GA sector is also good for CASA. Thank you, Senators.
Thank you very much for that, Mr Hurst. Senator Patrick, would you like to...
Yeah, I'd be happy to start off. Thank you. Can you just give me a bit of an outline of what it is your members do? And sort of
certainly, Senator.
Yeah, the scope of their operations and so forth.
Yeah, we represent approximately 90 businesses, AOC holders, and they conduct all of the aerial application in Australia. So spraying of crops to protect them with chemicals, frost protection, sowing of crops like rice and wheat. We do a lot of firefighting work, so the entire single engine air tanker fleet is constituted by my members. And in addition, we represent a whole bunch of helicopters. So we do, basically we rely on providing a service to end users, whether they be farmers or state emergency service operators. Okay,
thank you. Across your membership, have you seen a decline in size and scope over the last decade, or have you sort of fared well?
No, we've been stable for many years. I've been in this job 22 years and it's been fairly stable in that time because we rely on both agriculture and bushfire fighting for our business model. If you'd asked me that question 3 years ago in the middle of a drought, we would have probably been given a fairly negative response that no, we've seen a considerable downturn in the industry. But because we work in agriculture, we're used to that. We plan for it. We understand that you'll get certain years in a drought period where you're just not going to have any work. So we've made our own arrangements. We've got a very resilient industry because of that, and we're able to respond quite well to downturns. So whilst the business hasn't changed that much, certainly the cost of compliance has increased over that period of time, and we've sought to work with CASA to reduce those costs by doing innovative things like a chief pilot course and our aerial improvement management system being recognised by CASA. But that's a checkered history as well, trying to get CASA onto a different paradigm.
Okay, and so that cost, I just wonder whether or not you could quantify this. Is it a monetary cost or is it a cost in terms of difficulty conducting business? Or I guess there's a bit of both that would be prevalent.
Absolutely. One of the big costs we have is in the time of managers, as McDermott Aviation pointed out, the time of management soaked up in having to respond to CASA requirements. Now, whether that's through audit or whether it's through just new rules being brought in, that compliance cost is quite significant and continuing to grow. And your previous witness, Mrs. Brown, talked about the issues involved with Part 138 for aerial operations. That is a suite. I sat on the technical working group. That is a suite that has significant cost impacts which have never been allowed to be considered by the technical working group. And for that matter, even the connection between risk management and regulations have not been allowed to. They've been prescribed in discussions of that technical working group, and I know because I was there.
Okay, so just to unpack that, there's a technical working group and you say CASA don't use that group. What's the purpose of the group?
That's a good question, Senator. The technical working group has been the subject of many years' worth of work by industry, free of charge. We turn up and don't get paid for it, to give advice to CASA on ways and means that we can actually address real safety risks. But as recently as a few months ago, one of the members of the TWG sought to raise a direct safety issue related to goods safety data. It was actually about private mustering versus commercial mustering. And they were prescribed by the chair of the committee from having any discussion based on that risk data that they brought to the table. So even with Part 138, which is the most recent one off the sausage factory, we're still faced with the same problem. There's a disconnect between real safe risk management and what the regs are actually asking us to do.
So no consultation. Was it purported consultation or simply?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. What we see is some appalling window dressing where the consultation for the last, and I've sat on the technical working group for Part 138 for the best part of 15 years, the consultation consists of CASA telling you what they've decided and then you trying to talk them down off the high building. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not. The maintenance regulations, for example, we were not. I also sat on that technical working group. And in an act of what can only be described as sheer bastardry, there was a separate element in the maintenance regulations for a B3 licence, which was meant to be a general aviation licence, which was removed just before the regulations were made. That's what we're dealing with, just complete misleading information being given by CASA as to what is going to come out in the regs. It has improved considerably over the last 4 to 5 years, but it is still not a coherent system where industry and CASA can work very closely together. The best way to do that is to use sector risk profiles as a starting point for discussion of risk management. There's a few sector risk profiles being done in cooperation with industry, but they currently sit as outliers and do not inform the regulatory development process.
Okay, are you aware of the changes to Section 9A of the Civil Aviation Act?
Yes, Senator, we were involved in supporting those changes.
Okay. Have you seen any shift in approached by CASA since that law came into effect in October last year?
Absolutely zero compliance, Senator.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chair.
Could you just expand on that? Zero compliance from whom, Mr. Hurst?
One would expect if you sit on a technical working group and you raise issues to do with the cost of proposed regulations, that would fulfil the exact scenario considered by those changes to the Act. We've been actively prescribed from having those discussions about cost in the current technical working groups that have only just put up to the Aviation Safety Advisory Panel. We only made our report probably a month or 6 weeks ago. And the technical working group made a report that clearly identified the report was a dissent report. We could not reach consensus in the sense that industry was in consensus, but CASA wouldn't accept that industry dissented from the way they were going about business. So even in the most recent case, the most recent TWG that's made a report to CASA, to the ASAP, that report was basically glossed over, and we haven't seen any discussion, sensible discussion at either the technical working group level or in our direct discussions with senior management about the costs of compliance or the cost of these regulations.
So that would be in direct contravention to the legislation and the change that was made last year to ensure that costs were considered, wouldn't it?
Well, I think as you've heard of previous witnesses, CASA is nothing if not cunning. So the way that they answer your questions in estimates, senators, tells you part of the story, but not the complete story. And I think...
They answer our questions, Mr. Hurst.
Sorry, Senator, I didn't quite catch that.
You're assuming they answer our questions.
Sorry, leap of faith. Yeah, the problem that we see is that what actually goes on at the ground level and within CASA from our own direct discussions and trying to work with CASA, what is represented, as we've seen in the CASA submission to this inquiry, is fanciful. I think it's a bit rich for CASA to try and quote out of context some elements of our submission to this inquiry or the AAA's submission to this inquiry as some sort of evidence that they're doing something right. We really struggle with leading CASA to water and trying to get them to drink from a program base that would actually deliver real safety outcomes. It's not all about regulation, it shouldn't be. But the regulations are so prescriptive, as you've heard time and time again. We cannot get CASA at the TWG level to focus on doing outcome-based regulations, which was a recommendation of the Forsyth report. It's inherent in the spirit of the changes to the Act that you've described.
Chair, can I ask a supplementary to yours? The TWG that you're referring to, just so that we can perhaps take this to CASA this afternoon, is that a particular TWG or is there only one? Can you just help me out there?
No, Senator, the primary consultation mechanism CASA now uses, and I do know a little about it because I wrote the original discussion paper to get CASA to focus on this, is the Aviation Safety Advisory Panel. And depending on what issues are before the ASAP, as it's called, they will then, through their head of power, create a technical working group for a specific issue. The way it's worked out is that there are technical working groups essentially for each of the regulation sets. So there's a TWG for Part 138. There's currently a TWG for Part 61, 141, 142, which is the licensing and training suite. So it's generally targeted at a reg suite.
Okay, so which regulation suite are we talking about where within the period since the legislation has passed, there was a, in quotes, consultation and a dissenting report provided? Which suite of regulations?
That was the technical working group for Part 138.
Okay.
And 138 covers all other aerial work that is not included in Part 137, which is aerial application, which is, to put it bluntly, my dung heap. Part 138 also has some fairly significant implications because it simply cannot work without a handoff to a rewritten Part 137.
Perhaps on notice, could you provide your interaction in respect of the TWG looking after Part 138, that being, an understanding of when the TWG was stood up, when it met, what reports were created, including by CASA and by the TWG itself, just so we can get a view as to that, because it's very interesting noting that this is post the change to the legislation.
Senator, only too happy to provide that to you. I would suggest I'd have to go and investigate what limitations I'm under as a member of the TWG to release documents that may or may not be CASA's purview.
Well, can I just put it to you?
Perhaps a question to CASA would be the same.
Sure. Now, just as you answer that question, noting I'm asking that question in effect from derived powers from Section 49 of the Constitution. I would be very interested in any pushback you have from CASA. So I respect that you have to go through your processes, but can you also provide any indication from CASA as to what you are not allowed to show us, or what they believe you're not allowed to show us?
Yep, certainly, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, Chair.
That's all right. Good question, Senator Patrick. So, Mr. Hurst, you've raised a number of times the lack of standard management systems within CASA, QA, continuous improvement, etc. Why do you place so much emphasis on systems within CASA?
A little bit of background probably helps, Senator. For the last 20 years, I've been, amongst other things in this job, a business coach for the business owners in our industry. We developed a business management system 10 years ago, and we've rolled it out now to approximately 40% of our members who are either accredited or seeking accreditation. So we understand that the power of a system is critical to getting consistency of outcomes. Now, whether that's for a risk management purpose or safety or a quality assurance purpose, systems are quite critical. The thing that amazes me in this day and age is that organisations, government organisations in particular, such as CASA, and I work across many different regulators, not just CASA, some of them are very good at systems and some of them are very poor at systems. I don't think CASA even makes the pretense, although I'm sure they will defend themselves, they don't make the pretense of having, for example, a continuous improvement program or a quality assurance program. They certainly don't have in their interactions with industry a risk management system, because we are actively prescribed from having that discussion during the regulatory development process. They half got there when they started to develop sector risk profiles. We were the first one. We were the peak body that worked with CASA to describe what are the key risks in our sector and what to do about them. And we think the sector risk profiles hold enormous power for a new cooperative model for general aviation and CASA to do better work. The problem is the culture of CASA. If they won't share power and they won't help put those systems in place, even in their own business model, they're certainly not going to recognise industry models despite our best efforts. And that's what we're working with them at the moment.
So you've identified that CASA regulations, particularly the newer ones, are not based on managing identified risks. I think we've talked around this in some of your earlier evidence, but specifically, what's your recommendations for fixing this?
It's interesting that we've actually seen some minor change in the last probably 6 months, maybe a little longer. And a good example is the Part 61 Technical Working Group for reform of Part 61, which is pilot licensing. Now, I'm sure others have mentioned to you that Part 61 is an absolute dog's breakfast. Even CASA admits it was poorly implemented, but they can't quite bring themselves to say it's a bad reg set. But they do have a reform process at the moment. Our great challenge with that reform process is simply trying to get the right people from CASA with the right culture to look at simplifying things, to get an outcome-based rule set, not to take shortcuts, simply to get an outcome base that gives us the flexibility to continue to develop. And Part 61 will be interesting to see what comes out of that. We put forward a very detailed proposal to simplify Part 61 for specialised training. Whether CASA takes that up is yet to be seen, although it looks positive. But But that again goes to the individual. It'd be great if they actually had a system that embedded that change or that culture, rather than having to try and get the right industry try and get the right individual to get some change. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, Senator. I'm sorry.
Well, just reflecting on that training issue, where in mustering helicopters, previously you were able to have on-the-job training. It would be up to 500 hours. It's taken very seriously. And now people have to go away to be trained by somebody who doesn't have the depth of experience, the depth of capacity. It's not on the job, and it's for a lesser amount of time. I mean, that perplexes me how that can possibly be a better outcome.
Senator, just to give you a practical example of how this pans out in industry, we've been trying to get changes to CASA Part 61 since it was introduced in 2014. The key problem that we see from our sector is that fixed wing and rotary wing have different rule sets. So that if you're in fixed wing, Part 61 requires you to have an aerial application operator proficiency check each year. That was a trade-off that we discussed with CASA years ago to improve safety. And unfortunately now, fixed wing can manage that because the chief pilot is empowered to do that, another initiative from us. And unfortunately, if you're in a helicopter, you have to go and find one of two, I'll say that again, two providers of this highly specialised training. One's in Tasmania, one's in southeast Queensland. How do you think that's gone during COVID? So we're really struggling to understand why CASA will simply not issue an immediate exemption, which we've been asking for 3 or 4 years, an immediate exemption to bring rotary wing operator proficiency checks into line with fixed wing. There's no safety issue. We've had the fixed wing system in place since 2007. Worked fine.
Well, let's make that a call to CASA right now, an immediate exemption that they allow for those flight checks for rotary aircraft to be carried out by the chief pilot, because these are the guys who've got thousands of hours on the job and know what they're doing, and yet we're going to send them away. Tasmania, goodness, that'll be handy if you're in Cloncurry, or worse, Senator Stirl, if you're all the way on the other side of the country, to be away at thousands of dollars in travel expenses, to be assessed by, flying away from the very people who know your industry and know your job. Yeah, okay. I asked the CEO of CASA recently about the Part 38 during his appearance before this committee during budget estimates. I was assured that industry was fully on board with that process. Significant less regulation was being brought forward in the Manual of Standards. And is that your understanding? And what was your experience in helping develop that regulation over some years? Is it now a good rule set?
It's not a good rule set, Senator, and I think my earlier comments on Part 138 highlight that to some degree that is exactly what you'd expect CASA to say with the culture they've got. CASA can never be wrong. CASA has to be talked down off high buildings on a regular basis, but they can never be wrong. And this is another example where Part 138 is wrong. And industry has told CASA that a number of times. And as I mentioned, if you want to get a flavour of how industry viewed the process of Part 138, the technical working group submitted a report labelled dissent. So we didn't support the MOS being made because we didn't believe it was fit for purpose, even though we'd managed to reduce the MOS from 180 pages of nonsense down to about 80 pages. But the problem with 138 rests fundamentally in the regulation suite, where we were never permitted, and remember, I've been on this technical working group consistently for 15 years or thereabouts, we have never been permitted to have a fundamental discussion about what operations have what risks and how they should best be managed. We actually made that work, we put it in our 138 submission, and it was ignored. As recently as, from memory, it was February of this year, I think we made that submission. So what you're being told by CASA about Part 138, that I also listened to, I really think is a bit of a misleading statement. Perhaps Mr. Carmody hadn't been advised by his staff that 138 TWG had put in a dissent report. I can't speak to that, but I can speak to what the view of the technical working group was, and that was more work was required.
Well, that has been my experience to date, is that you get an answer which leads you to believe that the question has been answered, but it's only ever half the information. And when you go back and question it, you're told, well, that they answered the specific part of the question that you gave, which of course is not in the spirit of a Senate inquiry, and certainly doesn't lead to better outcomes for industry. Look, I have another question around the helicopter operator proficiency checks and the cost required. I think we've covered off on that. We've covered off on Part 61 pilot licensing. I was pleased that you made reference to the Fawcett report. I've gone back and read that. There are recommendations in that have still not been adopted, and it was a terrific practical report from somebody who has deep experience in the aviation industry, and Senator Fawcett. So, frustrating to be given the answers and then not have them go through. Unless Senator Sterle, you have a question?
Thanks, Chair. Chair, I would endorse that the committee do write to CASA to request an immediate exemption on the issue we were just talking about for the training, and be interested to, under your signature with our support, and flag that with the committee. Be interesting to see why they can't.
Senator Sterle, thank you very much for that practical suggestion, and to the Secretariat, I would ask that we follow through on writing to CASA to ask them why there couldn't be an immediate exemption to the helicopter operator proficiency checks to allow the chief pilot of their businesses to carry them out. It is well recognised, particularly in the mustering sector. So thank you, Senator Sterle. We will with your support, go forward with that.
Can I just ask one question, Chair?
Of course, Senator Patrick.
Thank you. I just wonder, everyone talks about the FAA suite as being much more pragmatic, much simpler to use. And my understanding is that aircraft that are operating under FAA regulations from overseas or FAA certification from overseas can fly here. I just wonder whether or not the strategy we adopt is to say, let's just drop that into the Australian context, whether that's a realistic suggestion or whether the other thing is we do is we make Mr Carmody's pay contingent on a reduction in regulation each year. The first question was serious. The second comment was perhaps not. But
he's leaving. He's leaving. He's retiring.
I understand, but would it be possible to just drop in the FAA suite?
If that's a question to me, Senator,
yes, it is, yeah.
I think we would struggle to drop it straight in. However, the starting point when we started work with CASA many years ago to get Part 137 rewritten, our starting point was actually to look at the regulations in Canada, the US and New Zealand. And we found quite a lot of commonality across those three regulatory suites. And so Part 137 in Australia took note of them, and we wrote them originally in that context. And that regulation suite was introduced in 2007 and has stood the test of time. It's been a really practical, useful set of regulations. So it can be done. I'm not convinced it's as simple as just dropping it in, but I think that would be a very good start to look at why not. And it may not be the FAA regs that you end up dropping in. It might be the New Zealand regs or some other regs that have good benefits, are simpler, and are outcome focused, and that's the big issue, that the regs are so prescriptive. And the interesting thing is, and I don't like criticising the individuals involved because they try hard, but to be blunt, normally the people who are put as project officers of these tasks within CASA have no experience in the sector themselves. So they might be sitting at a table with pilots and operators that have millions of dollars wrapped up and thousands of hours of experience, but their opinion trumps industry's opinion. And yet industry, as you've heard a couple of times today, industry is the one who creates safety. The regulations are a low-level requirement that we're all quite happy to meet if they were simple. But the regulations seek to micromanage your business and run your business. So yes, a move to at least benchmarking against international regulations would be a good start. But we're very shy of that. We're very shy of the bona fides of CASA doing that, given our experience with the maintenance suite, where we were assured that the ARSA-style rules, as they were called at the time, would be internationally recognised, would be transferable from one jurisdiction to another, and would be scaled to match the complexity of the company being regulated. And the first thing that CASA did was that they removed the B3 licence to get rid of GA lamies, with no consultation with industry at all. And we were all caught flat-footed. We could not believe, to be blunt, that we'd been lied to and misled. Now, that was under a previous DAS about 2 DASs ago, I think, 3 DASs ago. Hard to keep count with the churn. But that's the culture that you're dealing with. The culture really hasn't gone away, because the same people who drove those decisions are still working in CASA today.
Well, that's an extraordinary statement, isn't it? Because this is reflecting on a regulator that is more interested in shutting down sections of the industry process and, the ability of the industry to work successfully. In fact, that's just tying industry's arms behind their back and letting them into the ring. I mean, it's...
Yeah, Senator, we've done everything we can as an industry sector. We're a small office, but we punch well above our weight in program delivery to our members and the broader industry. We've done everything we can to work with CASA cooperatively, and it's even led to some success where we've got our chief pilot course that is a skills-based course, competency-based course. We've now got that recognised by CASA. We were hoping that was the new dawn and a start of something extremely positive. But it's certainly better than what CASA had on offer, which was a half-day inspection and a flight with a pilot to determine if they liked the cut of your jib. And then you might be found to be a fit and proper person and approved at the will of the FOI, whereas our course is 3 weeks pre-reading, 3 days face-to-face, conducted against a syllabus, etc., etc. So industry is very willing to work with CASA and to not skirt our duties to provide something that's meaningful and got depth. The problem is getting a CASA culture that's willing to look at that and go, that's the best way to get safety, not through additional regulation.
All right, Mr. Hurst, thank you very much for your contribution. I do invite you to make any additional submissions based on the questions or the evidence today, but please go with the committee's thanks.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Senators.